Good evening, and thank you for joining Public Narrative for our evening, our celebration of change. I'm Jamira, the President and Executive Director. I want to walk you, back down memory lane a little bit. I've been at the organization for 2 years, and when arriving at Public Narrative, I arrived a student of the organization. I had much to learn of its rich 31-year history, and in learning of the organization, I learned much about its relationships with journalists and community organizations. As of late, we have strong relationships with young people to help them amplify their voices, to become familiar with their voices and understand how to exercise their voices for the sake of the world around us. I am so incredibly excited for you all to join us this evening. We'll hear from several of our esteemed project partners. We'll hear from some esteemed panelists to really reconcile this moment that we're in. But I first want you to understand something. Before coming to Public Narrative and starting my career, I learned a lot about storytelling. And one of the things that I learned from an early mentor is that with everything that happens in life, in our personal lives, our professional lives, every day we have to approach situations with fresh eyes. No matter what happens yesterday, today, tomorrow, we always have to approach situations with fresh eyes. And I'm really excited about the first panel discussion as we hear from 3 women, their profound stories of heartbreak, of devastation, be it in their own families, but much of what we've learned as American history. We'll first hear from Michelle Dustin, author, professor, and public historian, and great-granddaughter of Ida B. Wells Barnett. We'll hear from Marty Tippins Murphy, the executive director of Faith and History and Ourselves, the Memphis chapter. And we'll hear from Karen Berry, general editor of ESPN's The Undefeated. This discussion, Reconciling the Moment, will be moderated by none other than Deborah Douglas, Pulliam Distinguished Visiting Professor of Journalism at DePaul University and 2019 Studs Terkel Award. Deborah?
Thank you so much, Jamira. Thank you for having us. And I'm so glad to be here with Marty, Karen, and Michelle. I just want to kick off the discussion and just get right in there and talk to the ladies and find out about the one thing that you have in common that I noticed that I don't know if people watching will have noticed. You are all American originals. So could you please describe for the audience your claim to the heart and soul of America? Because I think you have one. Marty, can you go first?
Hi, sure, I would be happy to. And I just want to thank Jamira and Deborah, Public Narrative, for inviting me to be this discussion tonight. And it's just an honor to be in the company of all of you, and especially getting to meet Michelle and Karen. So thank you so much. So my story as a middle-aged white woman at this point in my life is really the story of a family that exemplifies the way the country was founded on slavery, and how that we are accountable for and continue to benefit in that current system. And so that was a story that I didn't know growing up. And it was, before I get into that story for just a moment, the other part of what I claim is the profound impact that learning the history of upstanders has had on my life. And I would definitely include Ida B. Wells in that, especially as someone who lived in Memphis and made a big impact in Memphis, as well as her work around the world and in Chicago. So, but again, both of those stories, my family history and the role of upstanders and those activists who advocated for change and what that really looks like, and who worked to fulfill the promise of democracy. I didn't learn either of those things growing up. My education failed me. It failed me in school, and it failed me in my family. So my family story, just to give you a little brief synopsis of that. I grew up in Nashville. My grandparents talked about one relative in particular a lot, and that was my great-great-great aunt Adelicia Ackland. And it was a very romantic story. It was antebellum Southern belle who was beautiful and Gone with the Wind and Scarlett O'Hara in my mind. And they talked about at one point she was one of the wealthiest women in the South. And so I didn't question that. I just thought that sounded wonderful in my imagination. And when I grew up, I became really interested in, what that, was that story true? What was it that they told me, and what had been left out? And, I didn't learn much about slavery in school growing up, but I knew that Adalisha Ackland got her wealth from her husbands, and that one of her husbands was a very wealthy man who had plantations in Tennessee, Louisiana, and Texas. And so, I grew to, as an adult, understanding that plantations meant slavery and recognizing that that's where that wealth came from. And it was at that time that I understood that Adalisha Ackland and Isaac Franklin enslaved over 750 people at one time, and that their largest plantation was Angola, now the site of the Louisiana State Penitentiary and the largest maximum security prison in America. But again, that was not a story that was talked about or even understood as I was growing up. When I first learned about Isaac Franklin, I didn't even know that I knew that they enslaved people, but I didn't know that he was a slave trader and that he was the co-founder of one of the largest slave trading firms in U.S. history. And so, my first question was, how could my grandparents talk about and know so much about our ancestors and family stories, and who was the second cousin thrice removed or the third cousin twice removed, and just not a word about the 750 or so people whose lives were intertwined with mine, and whose lives are certainly intertwined with mine and their descendants. And that silence still stuns me. And I can talk more about how that story unfolded if you want in a little bit, but the journey doesn't stop there.
Thank you so much. And thank you for being so candid and so transparent with your family story. Karen, what is your claim to the heart and soul of America?
I'd also like to say thank you for inviting me to speak. I'm the descendant of Charles Brown. He was my great-great-grandfather, maternal side of the family, and he was hanged in Wilkinson County, Mississippi in 1879. He was one of thousands of Black men, women, and children who were victims of terror lynchings in the United States. And I believe his killing is a reminder of the evil of racism and white supremacy. I've written about him since about 2006, and my goal is to reveal his story to the world. Nobody was arrested, nobody went on trial, there were no sanctions, or nobody went to prison for killing my ancestor. And I believe this is the way to tell his story, and also to tell the stories of thousands of descendants of victims of lynchings. I just also believe that this is a way to honor his legacy. I haven't done a whole lot of speaking. I see this as an opportunity also to talk about his legacy and add that to the writing. I wrote about his lynching for The Undefeated, where I'm copy chief, general editor, and went to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice for the opening of that memorial in Montgomery, Alabama. And he is part of that memorial. So I think it's just a very important story. And I would say that I am part of the thousands of people who are descendants of lynching victims who can lay claim to the heart and soul of America.
I think it's just so fascinating that you're here. First of all, I encourage everybody to go online to The Undefeated and read Karen's story. It is beautifully written and researched, and the display is also fascinating. It literally takes you on a journey. And I'm also just fascinated that we can see you and touch you and feel you, that you're a human being that we can connect to stories that we always have heard about, but they just didn't seem quite real because we didn't have a physical place to attach to those stories. So anyway, thank you for sharing your family with us. Has
Thank you.
Michelle been able to log back in? Not yet? Okay. I'll cycle back to Michelle when she gets back in, but I want to go back to you, Marty, and your family story, and your feelings and the way you process your family story, knowing that they were deeply implicated in our country's original sin, which was enslavement, and everything that came after Jim Crow, mass incarceration, the whole cycle of things. How did you come to terms with the information? And then a follow-up would be, what can other people who have similar backstories learn from you?
Great, thank you. As I said, I was just stunned at the silence when I first got the information. But I could also remember that even though my family didn't necessarily talk about our connection to slavery, there were certainly comments or beliefs that were talked about in terms of how slavery wasn't so bad, or that, after freedom, that African Americans weren't ready. And so they were, passing on that racist narrative as well. So, I think because of where I was in my journey when I actually went back to look, I think it was because I was, becoming, getting into facing history. And so that was really that curiosity and trying to uncover the truth. And so, my first impulse was really to try to figure out, what do I do with this knowledge in a way that can, be accountable for what happened in my family, but, sort of within that larger context of our society too. And I think that a lot of people that are in this in my shoes might say something like, well, that was the past. I didn't do that. But I think I really wanted to think about, what are the benefits that we still continue to have from the white supremacist system. And so, first is just telling that story. And it's two-part, though. It is that telling the truth about literally the past, and what we didn't talk about slavery or trading or interrogating that. But the second part is how we were part of creating and perpetuating that false narrative, that narrative of those racist notions and stereotypes and the damage that did, and how that got passed on from generation to generation. So, in my own work with Facing History, I talk about that a lot. And, our mission is to use the lessons of history to challenge teachers and students to stand up to bigotry and hate. And I take that as my personal challenge as well. And so, in terms of really talking to people who may have, interest in kind of looking at their own family histories, I think it's, just being willing to sit with that discomfort and that truth, but then to think about, the people who were the victims of that experience carry the burden of that trauma and the burden of that knowledge and memory in a way that we didn't have to. And so I think we have to reckon with that as well.
I'm nosy. I want to know what it's like being with your family at a family supper. Are you the outlier?
Well, I haven't seen my family in 6 months to have that kind of conversation. There are people that still really do not want to have it, and they just are really upset that I'm talking about this. And then there are family members who, really pushed back at first, but are staying in dialogue. And so we just keep talking. And, I can see that those conversations have made progress. And, the other thing is, I say this to people, if you got the relative that just doesn't want to have that conversation, well, there's plenty of other people that are in my universe that I can talk to.
That's fascinating. I'll cycle back to that. I'd like to welcome Michelle. Come on down, Michelle. We are, I'll come back to the initial question about you describing your claim to the heart and soul of America. Tell us why you and your family are so special to me. Can you hear me, Michelle? Okay. While Luis is still working to get Michelle pulled in, I'll come back to you, Marty and Karen. And I do have some more specific questions, but at this point, I just really want to know, to speak to the title of this session, what does reconciliation mean to you, especially given everything that we're going through right now, and especially just what happened yesterday, which reminds me of what Karen just talked about. Karen, would you like to go first?
Okay.
Reconciliation to you.
Okay. I had to think about this carefully because, like I said, even though lynchings were reported in the newspaper, newspapers are the source for the lynchings documented by the Equal Justice Initiative, which created the memorial in Montgomery, Alabama. Mm-hmm. So the question is, when everybody who's involved is dead, how can you have reconciliation after that kind of event? It was a murder. It's still horrible, and it's still a crime, but it's more than 130 years later. So here's how I decided to respond. Lynchings, like I said, were reported in the newspaper, and sometimes they were reported as an event, an upcoming event. Go down to the prison and get this person who's accused of an attack, say, on a white woman. Even so, they have an aura of secrecy. In the family, we only had a little bit of oral history about the lynching of my great-great-grandfather. My grandfather told me that he was a carpenter. He was working for a white family who decided not to pay him. He told his wife he was going to go get his money, and then they never saw him alive again. So I was able to document that he was hanged. There's more than 10 newspaper articles published nationwide, because I think of how, because of the lurid way it was reported. You can find little articles, big articles about the lynching of Charles Brown. So because they were public, I believe, and they were common. That's the other thing that's so stunning about it, is that they were so common. And if you look at the newspaper where my great-great-grandparents lived, they had a list of people named, some unidentified, who had been killed the preceding week. That's how often it was happening in that period of 1879. So I think they should be discussed. Lynching should be discussed and taken out of this secret sort of thing that is in the past and therefore should not be discussed. I compare it to the history of police brutality. Many well-known riots started as a result of encounters between police and Black people. It's gone on for decades. And one aspect I see, a major aspect I see of it, is to compare lynchings in the past and police brutality today, is that it's that effort to exert power and control over Black people.
Hello?
Got it. Thank you. Is that you, Michelle?
Okay.
Thank you for that, Karen. Michelle, can you hear us now?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes. So I'll come back to the original question, which was, describe to the audience your claim to the heart and soul of America.
Oh.
Michelle?
Well, yes.
So, did you get the question?
No, I did not.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I'm going back to the original question. Is that because you're an American original, describe your claim to the heart and soul of America? What's your point of entry to this discussion specifically with these two women?
Well, I am a direct descendant of Ida B. Wells, who was a journalist who chronicled lynching during her day. And so for us, that's a fortunate thing because she left a record for us to get insight into exactly how brutal and how common the practice was. And unfortunately, I think her work is relevant today because things haven't changed as much as I think she hoped, and probably all of us hoped they would. It's just sort of oppression and brutality is being manifested in a different way today than it was during her time.
Yes. You've written several books, and you talk about the fact that she left a record. When did you start engaging with your great-grandmother's record in your lifetime?
First, well, I mean, I grew up knowing that I was related to her. So,
you know,
I knew
about for your family. So,
well, I mean, I knew that she was involved in journalism and that she chronicled, what was going on during her time, but I didn't really realize the magnitude of what she did until I was in adulthood. And the first time that I got kind of more in-depth perspective was in the 1980s. When I was in my 20s, I worked on the documentary film, the PBS documentary film, Ida B. Wells, A Passion for Justice. And while I was working on that film, I started doing research. Actually, the filmmaker, Bill Greaves, had me do photo research of lynchings. So I, at that age, was in the archives looking at hundreds of pictures of lynchings. And so that made it real for me just to see those images and to see how many there were to choose from. And then also I went with him to film in Memphis, where on the location where the three men that she knew, that Ida knew, who were her friends who were lynched, the location where they actually were murdered. I mean, to this day, in 2020, that land has not been built on. So that was sort of, I felt like I was in kind of like an open grave. So it really had a profound effect on me. And then I kind of did my own thing for about 20 years. And I guess sometimes it's hard to get away from this.
You did your own thing. What does that mean?
Well, I mean, I worked in a profession that was not in any way connected to my great-grandmother's legacy. Mm-hmm. I worked in advertising and marketing and writing. So I was writing commercials and writing, marketing pieces for mostly corporations. And I did a lot of event planning as well, working on programs that were focused on African-American history. But I wasn't really involved in anything specific to my great-grandmother until about 12 years ago. And then I kind of got back into being involved in some of the things that my father's generation was doing. I wanted to know what they were doing and get involved. We have a family foundation. And so, I think some of these things are generational, because while your parents were doing their thing, you're doing your thing. And, but then as my parents' generation started getting older, then I was like, okay, well, let me see what I can do to help.
Got it. Tell us a little bit about her friends who were lynched. What were their names, and what was the situation that got them in that predicament? And does that predicament have implications for how we're behaving today?
Right. Well, she had three friends named Thomas Moss, William Stewart, and Calvin McDowell, who were the owners of a grocery store in this area called the Curb, which is in Memphis. At the time, it was outside of the city limits in a predominantly African-American community. And when they started their grocery store, a man who also owned a grocery store felt like they were in direct competition to him. And so he decided to basically create a situation where they felt the need to defend themselves. And then, they turn around the narrative and say that the Black men were the aggressors. And so they were the ones who needed to be treated as criminals. And so they were ultimately lynched. And so that has repercussions today when you think about actually the ruling, what just happened today, with Breonna Taylor, where, a perfectly innocent person was killed, and they're using the fact that her boyfriend fired the first shot as a way to justify, shooting multiple bullets into the apartment. So that's very reminiscent of what happened with my great-grandmother's friends, where, you have these people storming into an environment, and then the people that are in that situation defend themselves against intruders. And then the people who are defending themselves in their own property, by intruders, are the ones that are criminalized.
Yeah. And that wasn't unusual to create those false narratives, right? And to view competition in that racialized kind of way, right? At that time.
Yes, it was very common to basically blame the victim. And I mean, my great-grandmother chronicled over and over again how a lot of times the people who were lynched were leaders of the communities, and they basically created the white people in those environments considered them to be an economic threat or a leadership threat. So, so it was a way, that's why I consider it to be domestic terrorism, because it was a way to create fear in the Black community, fear of sort of, quote, getting out of your place, which is at the bottom. If you dare to challenge the power structure and dare to strive for more than nothing, then you're considered uppity, you're considered, some kind of a threat. And so it was a mechanism that was used to make it so that most people would feel afraid to strive for more, dream for more, push for more, agitate for more, and just be happy at the bottom.
Yeah. I do want to ask you about reconciliation in a moment to speak to today's theme, but I want to go back to something that you talked to me about in a phone interview one time about your great-grandmother's legacy and the dynasty that you lost when they destroyed her business. Could you talk to me a little bit about that? Because when you compared it to like publishing behemoths like Hearst, that really just blew my mind and opened my eyes.
Right. I mean, my great-grandmother owned 1/3 of the newspaper of the Memphis Free Speech, and it was destroyed. And so she, was in New York City when that happened and her life was threatened, and she was told to not go back to the South, otherwise she would be killed. Basically, she was in New York with the clothes on her back and I guess a suitcase or something, because she had gone out of town to go to a church conference. So she really lost everything that she owned and had to start all over from scratch with pretty much nothing. And she spent the rest of her life working with minimal amount of financial wherewithal. And I mean, she's really well known during her time, and even now she's really revered. But I don't think that a lot of people realize the financial sacrifice and the financial impact of all the loss that she had. And there are times when I wonder if, you know, with the business savvy that she had, and if it would have possibly been passed down through the generations, if here I am 3 generations later, you know, we would have been wealthy as a family instead of, you know, constantly kind of starting over again.
I get it. So I want to bring up the theme of today's discussion, which is reconciliation, and your view of reconciliation and what can be resolved given everything that has just gone on in the past week. We just can't get through the week.
I mean, it's every 5 minutes with this current administration.
Your tweets about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's just exhausting and it's very disappointing. You know, there are times when I almost feel like I had false hope in 2008. And, you know, and why would I ever believe that this country could move forward, you know, in a continuous way without this rage, you know, of how dare Black people, you know, ever achieve anything that some people consider to be their, you know, birthright to own. So there is this sort of rage against Black achievement. And that is definitely something that my great grandmother recognized, that, you know, I'm really bad at memorizing quotes, but she made comments about how white people were fine as long as Black people were, you know, in the saloons, drunk and vagrant, whatever. But as soon as they strive to do more, then it's a threat. And so, you know, it's just I think what's going on now, I didn't think of it exactly at the time in 2016, but now I really do think that what's going on now is a very strong reaction to 8 years of not only Barack Obama being president, but all of the cabinet members that he had in his administration, and, you know, so many decisions that were made that gave more equality and more equity to people who are people of color and LGBTQ, and, you know, on and on. And so there's just this like feeling, I guess, among some people that they're losing when somebody else wins.
Yeah. Does that comment about rage resonate with you, Marty and Karen? And if it does, how and how are you coming to terms with this perceived backlash? Marty, Karen?
Sure. Yeah, I can respond to that. Yeah, I mean, it does resonate, and I think that I agree with Michelle in terms of it being a backlash to 2008 and, you know, what we were seeing happening there. And I also feel like it's kind of in a situation of, it feels like it could go one way or another. And I think that, you know, before we get to reconciliation, we have to get to reckoning. And I feel like that's the moment we're in, is a moment of real reckoning. And for you know, people that are white, need to ask themselves, what am I to lose? And, you know, listening to what Michelle about, you know, what her grandmother lost with her business, and also what all of that, and what Karen's family lost with the lynching, great grandfather, you know, that, you know, devastation and personal trauma, but also, you know, what that literally meant for your families. We haven't had to think about that. And then the people that are feeling aggrieved feel like they're going to lose something, and we haven't really made that value proposition yet of why this matters for everyone. And so I think that, in this moment of reckoning, one of the things I just wanted to lift up with the work of facing history in ourselves is that, we work with, our approach is to bring in diverse perspectives and histories and backgrounds and experiences, and our staff and the communities that we work in reflect that. And, we work a lot in Chicago public schools. We're very proud of the partnership with Chicago public schools, who have created, at the request of the mayor and the superintendent, a curriculum on Red Summer 1919 that they've been rolling out. So, students have the opportunity to look at these histories. In Memphis a few years ago, we had students who were assigned to explore what it meant to if African Americans crossed the color line, got out of their place, and they discovered a story of that no one knew about, L. Persons, who was lynched in Memphis in 1919 to a crowd of 5,000 people. And to Karen's point, it was in the papers, it was advertised. Parents took their kids out of school.
Didn't they?
What's that?
They sold sandwiches.
Yeah. Yeah, but the students that learned about that, and it was a diverse group of students, really, they did reckon with it, and they wanted to tell that story and look at L. Persons not just as a victim, but a man in his full humanity, and make sure that his story was told. And they led, in partnership with the lynching sites of Memphis, an effort to get a marker for him. And so, this opportunity to study these histories can be really empowering for students to learn the truth of history and give them the tools to move forward with that.
I love your work, and I just love going to the Facing History site to learn something new every day. And I really appreciate your comment about seeing L as a person in his full humanity and not just as a victim. It reminds me of my practice in journalism, which is to asset frame as opposed to deficit frame. And the stories come out way different and richer and more robust, true, and authentic when you asset frame. Michelle posted the quote that she was talking about. Michelle, would you like to read it?
Yeah, now I have to find it.
You got it?
The doors in churches, hotels, concert halls, and reading rooms are alike closed against the Negro as a man, but every place is open to him as a servant.
Yeah. I wonder about the psychology of that. And I also wonder about this reflexive reaction that to allow one group of people to rise means that you have to manage your own obsolescence. Does it have to be that way? And that question is open to everybody. Any thoughts? I think Michelle,
of how
there she goes.
How enslavement was justified through science. Because there were, literally scientists who gave all kinds of quote, proof that Black people were biologically inferior. And if you look at those studies and read all of these, claims of we had smaller brains and we have thicker skin and, all these type of biological and physiological differences that make us, they, in their minds, really justified their idea that we are inferior. And so if you're being taught that, in order to dehumanize somebody else and justify within your own head that those people are different than me, in a way that makes you better, then I think it's inherently more difficult for somebody to accept that somebody who they consider to be inferior to actually outperform them. So it kind of, in my opinion, it seems like it kind of messes with their head. Like if you think that somebody else is literally biologically inferior and then they outperform you, then what does that say about you to yourself? So you have to figure out ways to justify that, they didn't deserve it. And I think until we unravel all of that, then we're always going to have a problem. And I also think, when you talk about reconciliation, I think truth has to come before that. And when you look at how much resistance there is to the 1619 Project and how people are trying to discredit it and make it seem like this is, this whole idea of reverse discrimination and, changing narratives and rewriting history, and all of these kind of language that's being used. I mean, I'm on Twitter and I see all the crazy stuff that's being said to Nicole Hannah-Jones, and I'm like, how can we actually move forward until we actually all have the same set of facts, and actually recognize that there was actual harm done. And that's one of the things that if anybody's bored and want to read the pamphlets that my great grandmother wrote about the Arkansas race riot and the East St. Louis riot in particular, she chronicles, in excruciating detail, exactly how much property was lost and what it was valued at. And so there is a way to calculate the actual loss. And put it in today's dollars, and so when people try to give this argument that, well, we don't know how to even calculate this. Yes, you can. If things were reversed, I'm sure they'll figure out a way. It is possible to look at how many acres of land were stolen, how many houses were burned, how many people were killed. You can calculate it, but there's this sort of, this attitude of like, well, it wasn't me. You can't hold me responsible for what my ancestors did or what somebody else did. And I'm not rich, so I'm not benefiting from, racial hierarchy. So until we get past all of that, I think it's going to be difficult.
Yeah, it's really funny. I think it's a kill the messenger type situation, because I learned about 1619 in Metro Memphis. My social studies teacher was the high school football coach, a white guy. And while 1619 fleshes all of that out, there was just no debate, So it's like, why is this a problem now? It must be who's telling this story. It's just unreal. You talk about, well, you and Marty have brought up truth and reconciliation. And Marty, you mentioned specifically reckoning. That seems like a lot of hard work. And you already talked about the people in your family. Some people don't want to talk about it. Some people might, be okay with being in dialogue. And I imagine that that's the case everywhere. So what's the point of entry to tell the truth, to reckon and reconcile, when it just seems like it's just a lot of work and people seem to be lazy, like intellectually so? And that question's for anyone. Karen, Marty, Michelle.
Yeah, I'd like to take a stab at that.
Yes, ma'am.
Two points I'd like to make. First of all, I think we're still at the reckoning stage, where we're still trying to come to terms with exactly what we need to reconcile about.
Okay.
And I also want to point out, because of this history of someone being hanged in my family, for no reason at all, actually, as a result of an argument, that just seems so evil. And I still cannot understand that level of evil, because the violence committed against lynching victims was horrendous, where bodies were cut into pieces and given out as tokens. And people took body parts home, and not only were some people hanged, but they were burned, and then they were beaten, and this is long after they were dead. So the evil, it's just so evil that I don't understand why and how it happened. Now, the other thing I would like to just toss into the mix is that we need to, as the other two speakers have mentioned, we need to acknowledge and come to terms with the evil of slavery, because white supremacy was created to justify slavery, and we can't say I'm not affected by slavery because I didn't own a slave. Well, our ancestors did not settle this, did not come to terms with this. So we're paying for that. It still resonates in our society because Black people are behind at all levels, economically, emotionally, our health, all affected because we're the descendants of slaves, of people who were worked to death, who didn't have adequate medical care, weren't fed, or clothed adequately as enslaved people. So we have to talk about slavery because that's the source. That's the source of racism in our society, because it was used to justify slavery. And if we don't want to talk about it, we're still going to be stuck at this level of arguing with each other about what's important and what's not important, because we just are so reluctant to acknowledge how harmful slavery was and how it still resonates in our society. Just because no one has chattel slavery does not exist in our society today doesn't mean that it doesn't have an effect. I am the great granddaughter of a slave. My great grandfather, my dad's grandfather, was enslaved as a child. So we're not that far from slavery for millions of Black people are not that far from slavery. So I think unless we're willing and to face it's past uncomfortable, because it's appalling. You know, it's just, I don't have words for how damaging I think it was to a whole race of people in the United States. And it's so huge that I just think it will be years before we are past reckoning and actually can move comfortably to say that we're reconciling, because there's just it's just so much, you know. We can talk about economics, you know, how it ran slavery. Give an example, and then I'll stop.
Okay.
Mississippi was one of the richest states in the United States until the day after emancipation, because all of its money was tied up in the slaves. So once the slaves were freed, everything went down to zero.
Yeah,
so
I actually interviewed a woman in Mississippi, and she showed me her Confederate dollars, and she opined how much more of it they used to have and how it didn't have any value. And I'm like thinking, lady, I'm the value.
It's worthless.
Yes.
I'll just jump in for just 1 second.
Sorry.
I just want to add to what Karen said, because I think too many people in this country want to think about the effects of slavery as something that only existed when slavery was part of our country's reality. But the bottom line is, after slavery ended in 1865, technically, we had another 100 years of apartheid, and then followed by, all of these efforts, with the redlining and restrictive covenant, and all these other public policies, defunding any kind of education system based on based on property taxes. Our country is steeped in making sure, doing the best that they possibly can to keep people, specifically African Americans and obviously other people of color, at the bottom when it comes to every metric that you can think of. And that is an extension of slavery. So we have, our country was built, became wealthy based on 250 years of, free labor. And the people who did not own slaves benefited from slavery, because when you think about insurance companies and bankers and all of these other institutions that were in the North, or even other parts of the South that still were part of, so you have cotton that's picked in the South by slaves, but where are the cotton mills and who's making the actual fabric out of the cotton? Most of them weren't in the South. So this country needs massive amounts of education.
Yeah.
When it comes to exactly how we as a country have been shaped by slavery.
There's a really good book called The Price for Their Pound of Flesh that goes deeply into the valuation of Black bodies. So thank you for laying out the timeline, Michelle. A couple of questions popped up. And so while I have more questions, I want to make sure that our audience has heard. Morgan Williams from Teach for America asked the question, the idea that white people lose if others are not victims is fascinating to me. What are white people afraid to lose? Anybody know? Karen, Marty, Michelle?
I think I'll just say really quickly, because I would love to hear Marty's idea. But what I think white people feel like they will lose is the idea
that they're what?
Superior.
Okay.
They will lose the idea that they are superior.
Got it. Marty, did you have any comment about that question?
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. I think Michelle's right. I think that, it's about giving up a status that people are very invested in. And also I think on the flip side of it, not really having explored why it could actually be liberating for all of us to, not necessarily continue to be in this place and really living the legacies of our ancestors and how they harmed white people have harmed Black people. But, we're all living that. We're all living that in terms of how we now have to take responsibility for it. So I think about humanity and human dignity, and that, dehumanization, of course, is most obviously to the targets, to the victims, but it also dehumanizes the perpetrator and the bystander.
Thank you for that. So Erica from Public Narrative has a comment. She says that we can learn from Germany how they reckoned and reconciled with the Jewish people after the Nazi regime was dismantled, held accountable, sharing the history, reparations, etc.
That's right.
And Deborah Nels from Corporate Boarding says that whites are afraid of the unknown. So we're at 6:26, and I want to squeeze in three quick questions. Marty, I want to talk to you a little bit about the euphemistic language that you described that was used in your family when you were growing up, the idea that your family owned plantations and not forced labor camps. And the role, and I want to explore the role of language in systems of oppression. And what are you doing in your work to address that?
Yeah. So with Facing History, a big part of what we do is ethical reflection and critical thinking and helping students develop that. And so, the power of language to hurt and heal is a big part of that. And so, we have teachers to think about being sensitive to contract with students if they're going to encounter dehumanizing language, right, in a historical text or in a piece of literature. Language, can be a moral vision to help us think about what is seen and unseen. Language is used to make what is very uncomfortable comfortable. And in a Facing History class, we can analyze both the literal and the actual definition of words. So like in the Holocaust, what does the term final solution actually mean? So that euphemism trivializes and distorts and denies. And, the students would ask, who creates that euphemism and why, and who benefits from it. And I think, there's also the power of language for liberation. And you hear the stories of freed people after enslavement who discarded the names that were given to them by their enslavers and got new names. And then finally, language in terms of learning terms, like, learn the term systemic oppression and systemic racism so that students can name what they see and what they've experienced and then be able to act against it.
Yeah, something amazing happens when you have a name for the thing, right, that you're feeling. Yeah, it's great. So I want to come back to Karen and talk about the idea, to talk about your travels to Mississippi to backtrack the story of your great-grandfather's lynching and to find out if you recommend that people maybe not go on a lynching vacation, but at least go back to their family roots to trace those family stories. What did you get out of it outside of the details? What did you get from going down that road and meeting those people, and even the people who were, or one person who knew who was related to the person who killed your great-grandfather? Michelle, you talked about a similar journey and something that I read that you wrote, and I'd like to hear from you too. So Karen, would you like to go first?
Sure. I really love researching my family. I must be a glutton for punishment because I've researched both sides of my family. So it's basically 4 family lines for years. And so I favor plotting out that plan yourself and taking a trip, a road trip and hit the sites where your family lived. Plan it out yourself. There are historical trails all over the United States. In fact, when I was researching in Mississippi, there was a museum. It was closed. A museum that was on a Black history music trail for Mississippi, but it was closed. So all you really had was a sign to look at. So I think that I would be disappointed if the only thing that was on an official trail were markers that led to a place that wasn't open and that sort of thing. Markers might have interesting information, but that I personally would find that disappointing. So I lean more toward creating that trail of your own for your family. Now, with the descendant that I was able to find and contact, she was a descendant of the homeowner who had refused to pay my great-great-grandfather. So I've been hoping to find anyone who was a descendant of that family, but they were like Marky's family. They just didn't talk about it. So she was the great-granddaughter, I believe. Her mother was the granddaughter of one of his children. So she was like a great-great-granddaughter, but she hadn't heard a word about a lynching. Her mother's family had left Mississippi and gone to Chicago. So they grew up north and really didn't have those strong ties to Mississippi. I don't believe any of the descendants of the homeowner still live in that area, in that county where my ancestor was killed. So I would love to find someone from that family, a descendant, who actually has heard the story. But I'm not optimistic about it. But I just think it would be so interesting.
Thank you. I didn't realize that we were over. I thought we had to 6:35, so I apologize for not being able to give you the floor for 2 more questions. But I have really enjoyed talking to all of you, and I'm so glad to know you. You're also very special to us and to our story. And I just want to thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you,
Appreciate
Marty.
the work of Public Narrative and all of you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Deborah, for that dialogue. And ladies, thank you so much for sharing your stories with us. Over the past year, we've collaborated with QIC with their partnership with the Social Inequality Alliance the Chicago Police Department's Youth District Advisory Council, and MBK Chicago, My Brother's Keeper Alliance, through the Obama Foundation and Thrive Chicago. My brother, to assist and support them in defining change, caring for long-term sustainability in the lives of people they impact. At this time, I'm going to invite one of our consultants and new board director to join us, Ms. Katie O'Malley, to talk a little bit more about the long-term sustainability in the lives of people they impact.
Hi, Jamira. Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me? Yes? Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Katie O'Malley. As Jamira mentioned, I am one of the newest board members for Public Narrative. And first, I'd just like to thank everyone for having me here tonight. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining and taking this very exciting and very necessary first step towards narrative change. As Jamira mentioned, Public Narrative is a rich partnership with UIC, and that is how I came to know Jamira and Public Narrative. I just recently finished my Master's in Public Health and MBA program, where my focus was on community engagement to build power both individually and in communities. And I feel like this is extremely relevant based on the conversation that we've just heard when we're talking about sort of the history of disempowerment at the individual and collective level of Black people at the to the benefit of white people. So when I first began this program, I thought that I was going to just be learning about health. I didn't really know what that meant at the time. When I began my program, I didn't know what I would be learning related to health, but I imagined it would be more medical reasons that people are healthy or not healthy, or that it would be the individual exercising more or eating healthier. I really was quite naive when I went into this program. And what I quickly learned was that there were so many non-medical and non-behavioral factors that determine whether or not a person has access to health. It's not even whether they're healthy or not, it's if someone can even access health. And these are called, we've all heard now based on COVID, social determinants of health. The non-medical things like the neighborhood that you live in, if you have access to a grocery store, if you have health insurance, if you have transportation, if you have a steady job with benefits. There are so many things that we take for granted that contribute to our health. And what I learned quite quickly was that in doing research in neighborhoods, I'll say first, we were doing research in neighborhoods that were facing poor health outcomes, and they usually lacked a lot of these resources. They were lower income neighborhoods. And I'm not from Chicago originally. So when I would ask, why are these neighborhoods the way that they are? Some of the stories that I would hear would be, people are lazy, they don't want to work, they don't eat healthy, they eat fast food. And it was all placing the burden on these individuals. And as we've just heard from the really interesting panel just now, it's really the history of our country and the history of our city, since we're in Chicago right now, the history of our city that's been set up in such a way to give some people access to transportation, access to health services, access to healthy foods, access to great education system. All of those access points, that has nothing to do with the actual behavior, right? So that's all giving these people a head start. And what I learned was that the story around why some neighborhoods are healthy and some are not is not at all related to the truth. And instead, we're just perpetuating these stereotypes over and over and over again. And so I'm so excited to be a part of Public Narrative to add stories to this narrative and to change this narrative, ultimately, to be more inclusive of all voices and of all stories, to include the way that our country was founded and the systems and structures that have led to and continue the oppression of non-white people and the resultant outcomes and inequity that we currently face across education, across public safety, and across public health. I think that Marty said it best with her family, that we need to be talking. We just need to keep talking. So I encourage us all tonight as we begin this conversation that we stay engaged in it and that we keep talking and learning. As I mentioned, through school, I learned a lot, and I'm still learning every day. Ultimately, it's approaching this process, this reckoning that we all are speaking about, that we all are at right now and must have, approaching it with an open heart and an open mind, and understanding that when one person has power that can change the world, and one person has power, they can then create an opportunity to give power to someone else. And that sort of butterfly effect can lead to really great change. And lastly, engage in democracy. As I mentioned, we all have individual power to affect change and to create collective power that can hopefully change some of these systems and structures that are very, very wrong in this country right now. And the way to do that is to engage in democracy. Early voting in Illinois begins today. So make sure that your ballot is submitted before November 3rd, that you check your voter registration, and that you make a plan for early voting, in-person voting, or however you're going to make sure that your voice is heard. So thank you so much again for having me tonight, and to the speakers who have already shared with us and who will share later. Jamira, I'll pass it back over to you.
So I'm going to toss it over to Jen Brown, the director of the Alliance for Research in Chicagoland Communities. And Jen's going to be in conversation with Deputy Director of the Riot Center, Phyllis Rogers, the founder and executive director of Peer Plus Education and Training Advocates, and of course, Darius Tandon, the co-director of the Center for Community Health at Northwestern Feinberg School of Medicine. Jen?
Thank you so much, Jamira. What a powerful event. So we're going to begin by just setting the stage a little bit about talking about what we mean when we say health equity. I'm going to share how this is described by Dr. Kamara Jones, epidemiologist and civil rights activist. He describes health assurance or the condition of optimal health for all people. Achieving health equity requires three components. One, valuing all individuals equally. That is, that there is no invisible, undervalued, or disposable people. Two, recognizing and rectifying historical injustices, as many of the panelists talked about earlier. And three, providing resources according to need, not equally, but according to need. That's a powerful definition. Analysts, Phyllis, Tanika, and Darius, to discuss how community engagement is really central to their approach to advancing health equity when we consider this definition. The coronavirus has obviously brought health issues and racial inequities in health in many of the ways that Katie talked about to the forefront. So maybe we can start by talking about how the health outcomes for your community or the communities that you serve during COVID-19 have been impacted by structural racism and the inequities that some of our panelists have talked about already. Why don't we start with you, Phyllis?
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot for having me. Pure Plus Education and Training Advocate, being a well-known fixture within the community, primarily on the south side of Chicago, and a home-based business. We have really felt it because we're only out there at certain times of the year, unless we're in partnership with other people. But for those that have our information and have stayed steadfast and touched base with us, we've tried to make sure that the resources that they need are still available to them. You know, our tag is Aware with Care, and we provide support services and resources to families in need. Our primary focus is always around cancer, but we do work with the whole person to make sure that those needs are met. The caveat to that is that because of working with people like yourself and other agencies that touch base with us, we have been able to keep them as engaged as possible during this time. But we really felt it because people are so used to us being visible. And for a lot of those people not having access to social media or to Zoom or to, to phones, and that we felt it. But I think it's going to get better, because the one thing for us, when we're out there, we create our own list. And so we're able to touch base with them through email, through social media for the ones that are on Facebook, and some of them that are on Instagram and possibly Twitter. So they are aware of what we're doing, and they know how to get in touch with us.
Thanks, Phyllis. Tanika, can you talk a little bit about how health outcomes for the community that you and Hana Center serves have been impacted during COVID-19 by structural racism?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So Hana Center, for those who might not be familiar, is a community-based organization. We provide social services and we organize our community for systemic change towards social, racial, and economic justice for all people, but especially immigrants. So during COVID-19, I think we, along with other, immigrant communities and communities of color, have experienced a number of ways that it's been particularly challenging to access healthcare and other resources, which really do have to do at the end of the day with structural racism as well as some other factors. For many members of our community, one clear way that there's less access to supports is language. So our community members who are, English as a second language speaking already struggle with barriers to really being able to even access, for example, the federal stimulus funds and a lot of the other support that's been made available to the wider public. In Illinois, unemployment is a great example. For a long time, there were no Korean resources. And so all of Illinois' Korean-speaking community members are pretty much calling Hana Center. And in that way, we split our resources that are typically devoted to public health and benefits with that work that's really critical as well. Another thing that many people don't know about our community is actually 1 in 6 Korean Americans is undocumented. And so, that means completely lacking, access to most forms of healthcare. And so in a time of pandemic where access to healthcare is critically important and life-saving, that's another huge way that our communities have been impacted. And as we know, this all ties back to who in this country we believe and who our policies support as being deserving of healthcare and deserving of equal access to these things. And oftentimes race, immigration status, gender, and other social factors are ways that, we only select some people through our policies who should really have equal access, which is, of course, not right.
Thanks, Tanika. Darius, could you weigh in a little bit about the communities that you serve and what's been happening for them related to the coronavirus?
Sure. Thanks, Jen, and thanks for having me today. So I do a lot of work in the area of perinatal mental health. We do a lot of intervention work to try to prevent postpartum depression. And COVID-19 has just been an incredible confluence of stressors for pregnant women and women who've just delivered. As you can imagine, there's a host of anxieties around not having a supportive partner be available with you while you are delivering your child, the limited ability to access support from individuals because of physical distancing requirements. And, also, at the same time that we are dealing with COVID-19, we are also dealing with, structural racism and a whole host of events related to racism in our country that have also, created additional stressors for, pregnant women who are Black and brown throughout the country. And it is just an incredibly stressful time for, the communities that we're working with. And, I think that there are strategies that we are able to use to try to meet those needs. But, it is increasingly, challenging for, many individuals who may have limited technology or limited support, to be able to access those types of resources. So it's a challenging time, but we are really trying to work both locally and nationally to try to provide those supports to this really vulnerable population.
Thank you, Darius. So, I'd love to hear from all of you, as we talk about addressing racial injustice, as we talk about, working towards health equity, and some of the conversations that happened earlier about narratives, and as Tanika brought up about kind of who is believed, whose story is told. I'd love to hear a little bit about how in your work what strategies do you use to engage community members that are being most impacted by these inequities to ensure that their voice, their leadership is central to how we address these issues. And, as Katie was talking earlier about ensuring that we're, not doing things on people, but with people.
I can start with that if you don't mind. For me, I do a one-on-one, and I just make the phone call, especially for those that I know that maybe would be with high risk, because we work with a lot of people with addictions, and we want to talk to them to see where they are and what support do they need, and if they are reaching out, for support, especially, with our young mothers that are now struggling, with childcare and how they're going to, get those kids back in school, and who's going to be there, to assist them if there's, they're just in a job right now and don't know which way to go. So with our resources, we'll make the phone calls and then direct them to someone else that may be able to give them that better direction than what we can. Because again, we're the resource, we're the connectors to put them in to engage them, to get what it is that they need. Because for a lot of them, they just don't know what to do. And the last thing we want is for someone to just throw up their hands and just give up. We know that it's hard. This is a hard time, not only for them, but for us that's trying to provide the services with little or to no resources at all. So we all have a long way to go.
Thanks, Phyllis. Tanika, do you have something you'd like to add about how Hana Center uses a racial justice approach to engaging communities and their voices?
Yeah, thanks, Jen. And I really appreciated the language that you used and the way you asked the question in terms of, I think you said the leadership or centering people who are most impacted. And I think that's exactly our strategy and our approach. It's not just our strategy, but it's what we believe is right at Hana Center, that and just in this work more generally, that in order to undo some of the wrongs that have been done, the only way to really do that justly is to center the people who've been the most impacted. And so that's actually why we believe in the model that integrates services and organizing, because through delivering critical services, we meet people in our communities and we build relationships with people who have the most need for these services, not because they're needy people, but because they've been locked out of systems of support, or they've been impacted by structural racism or other issues. And then we organize together and we develop our shared leadership and make our voices heard around policies that can change the whole spectrum. And then by centering those who are most impacted, we believe we can truly achieve policies that will not leave them out, right? We won't make any compromises if our work is truly being led by those who are most impacted, because they're the ones leading it. And one additional simple way that we try to live that out is that we try as much as possible to have our leadership at Hana Center reflect and be from the community. 98% of our staff at Hana Center, so -1, are immigrants and people of color, and 100% of our board. And we believe that it's not just representation in name, but truly who is leading the work makes a big difference in the outcomes and the impacts.
Thanks, Tanika. I believe we agree with that wholeheartedly. And Darius, I'd love for you to weigh in on this too, because especially with some of the concepts that were raised earlier about how racial injustice historically has been justified through science. And so being in an academic environment, being engaging communities through research. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, and being at institutions and in academia that does not have that representation in the way that Tanika has described, in leadership and otherwise. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, kind of your approach to engagement that really addresses that, or seeks to center communities in your work.
Yeah, I think it's a huge issue, and I do feel that in the year 2020 we have improved on engagement from, if we were to be doing this panel 10 years ago, I think I would have a far more pessimistic view of what is being done. So I do think that there are efforts that are being made to better engage stakeholders. But I do think that one of the things that is missing, and that I think Phyllis and Tanika pointed out, really eloquently, is engaging consumers, or engaging those who are really affected by health. I think it is easy for researchers sometimes to work with an executive director of an organization, a clinician who is serving a family, a health or human service provider, but we don't always reach out to those who are affected. In the case of my work, it's women who have experienced postpartum depression, and they are able to give me perspectives on, well, what's important to them as we are delivering our interventions and services. What are the outcomes that they are interested in that might be different than the ones that I'm interested in, or those other types of stakeholders are interested in? So I think one of the things that's really important is not to, say that the perspectives of other types of stakeholders are not important, but fundamentally the consumer, those who are affected, have to be involved, and also have to be involved early on. I think that is something that sometimes we don't always see. We might reach out to those stakeholders at some point, in the research process, but they need to be involved early and often.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you raised really strong points about kind of the valuing, again, it comes back to, what is expertise and what is valued, what type of information, what type of perspective, and that lived experience being something that's valued, not just an academic degree or a title or something like that. And I think that, many of you are also bringing up, this idea of, it's not just listening, but changing decision-making, the way, what it leads to, and really thinking about how to shift that power. So not just listening to them, but shift the power to them for those communities that are involved. I can't believe how fast this panel time has gone, but I've already getting the signal that we have just a few minutes left. But I wonder if we can just go back around one more time to each of you and have a little bit of your perspective about specifically the role of, storytelling or story sharing, and the impact of having community members, having people with lived experience, having their stories, their voices authentically represented. I wonder if we can just go back around and have each of you speak to that briefly before we finish up.
Sure. Okay. I think that's important because with the storytelling and sharing, that's a way of relieving and to get feedback and to know that they are okay. And because I spend all of my day on the phone, I'm hearing stories and giving back and forth all day, regardless of what that story is. If it's a good story of something that they welcome, or something that is horrifying, we have to be a listening ear and to say, what, your story is okay. Your story does not have to be all the way over here like the next person's. Your story is yours, and it's your personal piece, and how that story is affecting you and your family and your loved ones in your circle.
Thank you, Phyllis. Jarius?
Sure. So, a lot of the work that we do, we may be, administering surveys to see if women are exhibiting fewer depressive symptoms, less stress, less anxiety. And while that's important, I would argue that the stories that we hear from the women that we work with are as important, if not more important. I mean, they really give us that depth and that detail on how the work that we're doing matters, right? It tells us, how does an intervention that we are doing with a pregnant woman, how does it help them be a better partner? How does it help them be a better parent? How does it help them be more responsive to the needs of their children? How does it help them with their quality of life? So those stories really are able to share insights and details and perspectives that the numbers can't always provide. And so stories have always been, I think, an important part of our work. And, I'd like to think that we always are trying to complement, the numbers that we are gathering with those stories so that we can present those back to the communities that we are working, but also, stakeholders like policymakers who I think really benefit from hearing those stories as well.
Thanks, Darius. And we'll come to you, Tanika, to finish us out.
Sure. I think in addition to all of the things that Phyllis and Darius already shared, I think, Jen, again, to use the word that you said earlier, I think to me, it's really about power. And storytelling is a form of taking back power of people who have been oppressed and disempowered. And I think when it comes to, for example, healthcare, there's a couple examples, even in our community this year. For example, many people know about the public charge rule and changes to, what immigrants are considered a quote unquote public charge of the, the government, and meaning if they access public health benefits, then they're now giving up their right in a way to ever have a pathway to citizenship for themselves or the people that they love, their families. And we had folks earlier this year who disenrolled from healthcare, for kids' health insurance. And in some cases, the benefits were not even part of the public charge rule, but people were so afraid. And the narrative, the hateful narrative that, they were undeserving of these benefits was effective, right? And getting them to disenroll. And so by sharing alternative narratives and stories, we have an opportunity to take back those narratives. For example, sharing the stories of what really happens for undocumented families who don't have access to healthcare during this time. One of our staff persons, fathers worked in a factory and got COVID. And while he recovered, he will never fully recover. He had a pre-existing health condition that will now be much harder for him to manage for the rest of his life. And I think telling those stories is a way to debunk some of the other narratives that are out there and to really show our community's humanity and to demonstrate the impact that unjust healthcare policies have and really seek a better, more just and more inclusive reality.
Thank you, Tanika. I think that you summarized a lot of the points. And I think, another thing that you're bringing up is stories are a way that for people who don't have that same lived experience to get proximate or to get closer to understanding. And, that's another part of when we've been talking about reconciliation and reckoning. And that's another part of the process that I think Brian Stevenson from the Equal Justice Initiative brings up is, we have to get proximate, to get closer to each other. I want to thank all of you, Phyllis, Tanika, Darius on the panel, and also thank, as we connect back to Jamira, thanks to Public Narrative for really bringing us together to have this conversation about the importance of community engagement and health equity and storytelling.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.
Of course, Jen, thank you so much for moderating that discussion, and thank you to our esteemed panelists. It has been a pleasure working with you all. Although we couldn't be together to discuss Turkle Awards this year, we did reach out to a few past Turkle Award winners to ask what gives them hope when they think about the future of journalism. Here's what modeling near Georgia, Annie Sweeney, Kathy Cheney, and Scott Simon.
It's a challenging time in our industry with the pandemic exacerbating the financial challenges of the legacy print and broadcast media that was already struggling to bounce back from the downsizing and the shutterings that were wrought by the impact of greater consumer reliance on the internet and thus on digital news outlets. However, What holds true now as then is that the legacy news industry continues to adapt and reinvent itself so that with the need for local news sources, watchdog, accountability journalism never more critical than at this time in our American history, I think that the old adage holds true that news of our demise has been greatly exaggerated. I think the digital age has created more opportunities, not fewer, for this beloved craft that we call journalism, and that gives me hope.
Hey, public narrative people, it's Annie checking in from home where I've been working since March, like so many of us. These are difficult times for everyone, including journalists, but it has never been a better time to tell stories. There's so much at stake, there's so much on the line. And that's what gives me hope about journalism is the number of people I see every day struggling to understand this moment, to do justice to this moment, to find the stories that need to be told. What gives me hope about journalism is the stories we haven't even found yet, the stories we haven't even heard. Thanks.
Hey, it's Kathy Cheney. I am a Stutz Terkel Award winner from a few years ago. I am the executive producer of Daily News and of the Midwest Hub for YR Media, and the future of journalism depends on us. I say that we need to invest in our youth reporters, Generation Z, our young millennials, our millennials. We need to make sure that we are doing what we can to mentor them, to lift as we climb, so that we can make sure that when we retire, we're leaving the industry in good hands. The future of journalism depends on us. It depends on you. So please invest your time and your resources in mentoring and bringing up the next generation.
Hi, Scott Simon here, and no doubt about it, hope is hard to come by these days. But you know what gives me hope? These past few months, while terrible, have reminded us all over again how important it is to be out there discovering information, telling stories that haven't been told from people who haven't been looked at in our society, telling stories and the same old stories in ways that haven't been told before. It's been more important than ever to give people fair, reliable, true information. And I think even if some of the old traditional platforms are disappearing or are severely weakened, this mission has become so important and we've been so enlivened by it. People are inventing new platforms all the time and, you know, going door to door if that's what they need to do. And I think the activism, I think the urgency of our mission, all of that is making me appreciate all over again what an important business this is and how important it can be in the lives of people. And to have that kind of work in these times is a real blessing.
Hey, Jamira.
Hey, Chris. It's so good to have you. Thank you for being with us. Just lead us into a conversation, you know, around your vision for MBK and certainly, you know, what all you all have done together as an action team. Certainly public narrative is just coming into the fold. But the work that you all have done over this last year.
For sure. Thank you so much for this opportunity to just speak around my passion project, and it just happens to be my career. My name is Chris Goins. I'm the Chief Equity Officer at Thrive Chicago, and I am the Impact Community Leader in partnership with the Obama Foundation, leading My Brother's Keeper for the city. A little historical context with My Brother's Keeper was started in 2014 by President Obama to be a targeted initiative nationwide that would address systemic challenges that boys and young men of color face. And he created this initiative in response to the death of Trayvon Martin. And we all know, and this conversation tonight has really shed light on the fact that like this work is more important now than ever. So a part of my signature responsibility is leading the My Brother's Keeper action team for Chicago. We are a community-driven collective impact initiative And we come together as a community, about 60 plus individuals in the community who have special initiatives within their organization, or they run their own organizations, all geared towards benefiting boys and young men of color. And to date, we kicked off in 2019, and we are approaching our 1 year kind of kickoff anniversary, and we're getting ready to go into year 2. And as a community, we've identified 4 pillars that we will focus on as My Brother's Keeper Chicago. And that would be an educator pipeline to address the dearth of male educators of color in Illinois and throughout the entire country. 2% of the American teaching force are men of color. The second pillar that we focus on is systemic mentorship. We want to professionalize the role of mentors in the lives of boys and young men of color, where mentorship is not seen as just a nice thing to have, but where it's seen as a necessity, and it's professionalized. The third thing is narrative change. We believe that there needs to be a deliberate focus to change the narrative around what people think and believe around boys and young men of color and all students of color. And then the last thing is like post-secondary pathways, and creating more pathways where boys and young men of color can achieve their purpose. And so I'm excited to facilitate a conversation with my friends, Brandon, Jessica, and Brenda. I don't know where Brenda went. She left. But at any rate, Brendan and Jessica are a part of this group. The MBK Action Team are very vocal, dedicated, active members of this group that I lead. And I remember both of you at our first MBK Action Team meeting, and both of you spoke very passionately around what's needed to shift the narrative for boys and young men of color. So I would just love for those that are watching to hear from you as to like, what did you say in that moment, and why do you believe there needs to be a narrative shift for boys and young men of color? And just take it from there. We'll start with Brandon, go to Jessica, and then Brenda.
Yeah, and I'm happy to be, to be with you guys virtually. We used to see each other all the time in person, but I'm glad we were still able to do things like this. And being there for boys and young men of color has always been something that's been important to me, because growing up, I had a lot of, grown men step up and take care of me when there weren't a lot of, Black men in my life to fill that role. And I think we need more of that now more than ever, to reflect, for people to see the reflection, Chris, I remember I interviewed you, I did a story, and you were over at Butler College Prep. And you were the principal over there, and you had this great course teaching Black men how to become teachers. And I was so moved by that, and things you said there about how, we need to look at things as mirrors and be their representation for other people. And so I've got a nephew who I know is going to grow up in this world that automatically sees him as a threat, and automatically, doesn't see the humanity, doesn't see the cuteness I do. They're going to see a monster at some point. And so I have to do what I can to protect him and create the best opportunities I can, and for other young boys and men of color around this country. So that's really where I come at from. And I don't remember what exactly I said in that moment, but I do remember, my nephew's what motivates me. Having a young boy of color in my life who I just love dearly, knowing what it's like growing up as a young boy of color and not having the opportunities, but having people step up in my life to create those. We got to do that here. We got to build that village. And we're doing that work now by breaking that school to prison pipeline and creating that pipeline of educators. So I'm thankful to you for allowing me to be a part of this work. I'm thankful to be with Jessica here to continue this fight. It's a long fight, but I think we got the right team to do it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brendan. I'm going to come back to you in a second. Jessica, what is your thoughts around narrative change? What is the narrative that needs to change for boys and young men of color from your perspective?
Yeah. So, and this like little reunion that we're having here right now is really throwing me back to the first meeting that I attended. And it just, I just remember that conversation where Brandon and I just kind of like piggybacked off each other when we were talking about the need for narrative change, not just in journalism, but in policy, right? In the decisions that are being made about our communities, right? So often we look at problems in our society and think about the people having problems and not the systems that have created these problems for our communities, right? And so in terms of like what needs to change is in the ways that we talk about our communities, about boys and men of color, what really needs to change is then we need to stop looking at like our boys and men of color as a problem, right? What problems did our society create that we are not responding to? And how as adults, right, that we've lived through this system and we've seen people fall out of that system. Like, what is our role in making sure that our youth have exactly what they need, and the barriers that we see in front of them, that we're doing everything we can to remove them, right? Because for too long, our young men have fallen victim to these systemic issues, right? And so I'm ready. I've been ready, but when Brandon shared that at that one meeting, we were talking about the narrative change. I was like, yep, it's journalism, it's in policy, it's in education. And I think about it especially because, interestingly enough, I studied journalism, went into education as a teacher, and then now I work in policy. So I use every single lens coming into this work now, right? Because we need everything in order to change outcomes for our students.
Yeah, can I jump in real quick, Chris? Because narratives, when we talk about media, it's often not thought about too deeply about the impact that really has. When you see, similar crimes across the spectrum between a white person and a person of color, how they're treated in media, tons of studies to show this, it differs. And that goes down to what pictures are chosen. The person of color, they'll choose a mugshot or a picture that may not show them in a positive light, whereas the white person will have a nice family photo or a smiling portrait, something, their Facebook profile picture. Those basic choices that are made in newsrooms create narratives. They seem very nonchalant. They're done maybe innocently. Maybe they're done subconsciously because of that subconscious bias, but they do have ramifications long term. And so, when we talk about narratives, and when me and Jessica were having that discussion, that's where it crosses, right? These things that might seem little to some people, a picture, it makes a big deal because that does frame and create this narrative around our boys and men of color. Sure.
Are you guys able to see me, Chris?
Yes, we can see you.
Okay, for whatever reason, I'm not able to see you.
I'm sorry.
But thank you for all of this. And as I think about this and listen to the ideas here, one thing that occurs to me is that I think that the change in the narrative needs to start with the individual. I think it needs to go to that young man and that grown man. It needs to start in his mind and in his heart. And I think it's time to get to a place where we are not so focused on other people telling our story, but we are empowered to be able to tell our own truth. And what I find in our work in my GPS, which by the way stands for My Guided Personal Story, is really helping young men to be able to claim their own narrative and empowering them through their experiences to tell their own stories. So we begin to shape how society begins to see us by how we manifest what we believe about ourselves. Yes, there are going to be others out there who are going to shape it in journalism and other places. But I think it starts with the individual. And as I think about education and the focus, especially on, science and math and all of the things that we know are so important, it's got to be supported by the root. And the root to me is that foundation that you have when you know who you are. And that's what my GPS focuses on, the fundamental question, who are you, young man? And to be able to go out there in society and stand with confidence and tell your story. That to me is the change in the narrative.
Absolutely. So when we think about the MBK community as a collective. The three of you stepped up and have been actively involved in helping to launch our narrative strategy. I would love to hear from each one of you in telling the audience about what is the specific thing that we are actually doing to change the narrative. And I hope that you all don't all say the same thing, but yeah, just really tell them, like, what are we doing in MBK? How are we approaching our narrative change work and the work that you all have been doing over the summer, and just providing different perspectives, your various perspectives around this work that we're doing right now.
I can start. You know, I think we early on were really trying to devise where we can find our place with this, where to start, because there's so many things that we're all excited to get into and fix and attack right away. But I think one place where we did see an immediate, need, and a place where we can make tangible change is through education, and creating a pipeline to try to get more Black males and males of color into the educational field. And so we're really honored to be able to have a lot of educators in our group, both from CPS, from the university sphere, people who work with kids on the daily. And so being able to come together with them, devise some good, tangible, honestly, just policy solutions and tangible solutions to involve colleges, CPS, and to get more people of color, more kids of color into the education field. Because the bottom line is, there aren't a lot. I mean, I grew up in the state of Ohio, never had a Black male teacher. I had one Black female teacher. When I went to Ball State for college, didn't have one Black prof at all. My Black history prof was a white German lady. So, which is, I say, kind of confusing, right? Yeah. So, but it reflects the lack of representation in that. And, I love this professor I had. She was awesome. Every professor I had was great, okay? But you can't deny the fact that when you have a person of color in that role, they can navigate better, relate better to the information, and relay it in a different way that can be better presented. They can also address, when in the high school level and in the elementary level, the challenges that these students are going through directly, because they've been there, they understand it. They didn't have to read about it, right? They lived it. So I think that's hugely important, and that's something we've been actively working for throughout the whole group.
Yeah, I think that Brandon did a great job of talking about the overall objective of what we've been doing in MBK. But one of the important things that I have experienced is the fact that you have done such a great job of bringing together such a diverse group of people. Yes, it is educator centric. I will say that. But the fact that you have invited people in from other walks of life, other worlds, policy and marketing and journalism and just all of those different things, it's important, because one of the things that are to me, that really will accelerate innovative change is looking at things from very different perspectives. And while we are trying to change the shape of education as we fill that pipeline with our men of color, we've got to look at it from new lenses. And so what I really appreciate in the work that we have all been doing together is an openness to really looking at these issues from a lot of different lenses, so that we don't keep coming back and doing things the same way.
Thank you. Jess, you're going to close us out.
Yeah. And I'll just add, the one thing that I think is especially important about this work with MBK is that the vision started with the boys and young men of color, right?
Yes.
The action plan started with listening to the experiences of our young men and hearing what their needs were, hearing what they were missing, and hearing what they're getting, right? We know that they want mentorship. They want opportunities to hear from folks that have their lived experiences, right? We also know that they are working to find their purpose in life, right? And what is the role that we play as a community in helping that happen? And then the other thing to that is that in that same vein, we realized that the boys and young men of color in the city of Chicago are concentrated in certain areas of Chicago. And we could already guess where that is, right? So then we needed the data to start understanding what access they had to opportunities, to travel, to transportation, right? Because if they don't have access to transportation, we can never give them an internship downtown. The internships need to come to them, right? So we need to start thinking about what are the barriers that we're experiencing and how, again, are we working to remove every single barrier that our young men are experiencing? Because again, we can't just put all the responsibility on them when every single barrier is existing in front of them to stop them from achieving their greatness. So,
Absolutely.
those are my thoughts.
You all, I am so sad that our time is already up. Thank you so much. Yeah, I know it's so fast, especially when you're talking about something that you're so passionate about. Thank you all for joining me in this space. And once again, thanking Jamira for curating these types of conversations. This is necessary, it's needed, and I'm so happy to be a part of this. And so at this time, I'm going to transition back to Jamira as she closes out the program. Good seeing you, Brenda, Brandon, and Jess.
See ya.
See y'all next week.
You guys.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everyone. Tonight's event was made possible by our leading change sponsor, Northwestern's Medill School of Journalism, and change agents like Elevate Energy, Marshall Gerstein, and the MacArthur Foundation. Special thanks to our friends at Local Voices Network and our funders for supporting our vision narrative. Our vision includes a heavy lift, and your commitment of time, your talents, and donations help to lighten everyone's load. Visit our website at Public Narrative. Visit our website to learn more at www.publicnarrative.org or connect with us on social media at Public Narrative. Together, we are Public Narrative. Take care, stay healthy, and please, focus. All right, thank you all for joining us for the celebration of change. Hope you have a great evening.